Today here on Lights and Buttons, we are building a new PC, and as you can see, all the computer parts have arrived. What we need is on the table. Our goal is to build a new video editing PC with a good balance between looks, performance, and pricing. We have a $2,000 budget, but I'll save the pricing information for the end because we ran into some roadblocks causing me to change up the parts that we originally planned. There are a lot of videos on gaming PC builds, but this one will be a little bit different, being a video editing PC. With this type of PC, at least in the past, it's more of a CPU intensive workload and less on a graphics card. Consumer video editing software often did not take advantage of a GPU unless you upgraded to the professional edition, but in the last several years, that has been changing. I have been using Sony Movie Studio 12 in the past, and that's one of the first consumer software that I've seen to use the GPU rendering capabilities so that you're not flushing everything through the CPU. Now, this software is getting dated, and I wanted to move on to something new, and in this case, DaVinci Resolve. Blackmagic offers their DaVinci Resolve for free if you go for the free tier, and that's something I wanted to try out. This software heavily relies on the GPU for rendering rather than just the CPU, so I'm going to also invest a little bit more in the graphics card. Storage, like always, is still high on the priority list. Speaking of storage, I used to have 3 Western Digital green drives in my old PC running in a RAID 5 array. I've also made some changes to the firmware so that the head parking feature doesn't kick in to save power. I thought this improved performance, but when you throw 3 slow drives together in a RAID 5 array, that's still a bad idea. So I'm going to learn from this and start off good with the Western Digital Black Series drives for better performance. Now, with the Black Series drives, they're not SSDs, but it's a good compromise between performance and costs, especially if you're planning to store a lot of data. For the operating system, we'll be using an NVMe drive using the M.2 interface for fast loading, and we'll include a spare SSD from one of my old setups for caching. Now, in the past, I've never had a dedicated cache or a scratch disk before, so this will be an interesting experiment on how much improvement in performance we'll see with DaVinci Resolve. I also want this to look pretty good, so I got a tempered glass case. However, the ventilation is a concern because there's a lot of surface area that blocks airflow, but we'll try to fix this up with some liquid cooling and also light things up with LEDs. So let's get on with the project. So let's talk about what's on the table. Starting from my left to your right, we have the Thermaltake View 31 case. It is a tempered glass case. It's an interesting design because it has a sleek look. However, one thing that I'm a little bit concerned about is ventilation. Now on the front, you'll see a solid glass panel, and the ventilation is actually to the side. There's 240mm fans right there, but the opening is relatively small. To combat this, I'm going to use some liquid cooling for the CPU as well as the GPU. And for the bottom of the case, there's also some ventilation, so we might be able to make some use out of that. Another thing that I didn't realize that I thought, well, duh, is that this being very shiny, it is a fingerprint magnet, so I'm going to have to be very careful in wiping it down and keeping it clean. Now next to the case, I have the 9th Gen i5 processor. It is an Intel i5 9600K, which means that it's unlocked, enabling us to overclock in the future. I don't plan to do that now, but sometime in the future I want to experiment a little bit more with overclocking. But with this setup, I do plan on eventually trying to get a little bit more performance out of it. Moving next to the processor is the RGB controller. Here at Lights and Buttons, why not RGB all the things? Now next to the processor, there's the out-of-the-box controller. This is more of a manual control from what I understand. So behind it, I bought the TT-Sync controller that will be able to handle up to 9 LEDs. So up to 9 fans, I guess whatever that plugs into the Thermaltake proprietary socket for the RGB lighting. We also have the thermal paste, which is necessary for cooling the CPU. And to the left of that, we have the 6 gigabits per second SATA 3 cables. And next to that, I have the display port to HDMI adapter. Now the screens that I'm plugging this into are not display port compatible, so it'll either have to feed off HDMI or DVI, so I went with the HDMI route. And next to that, I have the Western Digital Black Series drive that runs off of SATA 3, so that'll be good for the mass storage. Above that, I have the Samsung 970 EVO M.2 NVMe storage that will host the operating system as well as key applications, so that way we have a very fast boot time and application load time. And swinging around to the back of the table, we have the EVGA modular power supply that is 650 watts gold rated, and that will power everything that's in this computer. And above that, we have the GeForce GTX 1070 video card. And above that, we have the Thermaltake CPU cooler. This is a 240mm setup, and hopefully it will help keep the case cool. And this CPU cooler is a closed loop system, so no maintenance required. And next to that, we have the MSI gaming motherboard. I know it says gaming and I'm trying to do video editing, but the overclocking part and the RAID feature is actually what drew me to this board, and it was at a good price. And finally, last but not least, we have the 16GB DDR4 g.skill trident-z RGB RAM that will provide the memory needed for the video editing as well as all the other applications that I'm running on this PC. For the screws, we have 2, 4, 6. Number 7's back here. Number 8 is here. And number 9 is actually right over there underneath this vertical card mount. So we'll have to remove this to get access to the 9th mounting spot. And now it's time to build the RGB CPU liquid cooler with the closed loop system. Now this comes with the radiator, of course. It has the RGB fans. We got the different mounting options, different brackets, screws. There's also a controller. Now let's talk a little bit about the controller. This thing comes out of the box with a Thermaltake RGB controller. However, it can handle only up to 5 different LED devices. Now altogether, we have 3 different RGB controllers. This being one of them that comes with the CPU cooler. The other one comes from the motherboard. That one's more of a basic design. There's different buttons on there to control different lighting options, but I think there's no software integration. In total, we have, for this build, at least 6 different LED devices that's capable of RGB, so that's why we opted in to buy an extra controller that handles up to 9. That way it gives us a little bit more room in the future if we wanted to expand this setup. Since the graphics card generates a lot of... Okay, let's try that again. Since the graphics card generates a lot of heat, we have the liquid cooling going on, and we want the radiator to vent the air back out to the rear of the PC. Now this was originally here, but it's the 140 millimeter fan is larger than EVGA's fan that comes with the video card. So I'm going to move this up here to the top. Hopefully it fits, and I move this to the back. Next up, the Western Digital 6GB drives. These will be used in RAID 1, and that way we have the reliability. One thing I appreciate about this case are the hard drives enclosures. The plastic here is pretty well built. For the 3.5-inch drives, there's actually little notches that they mount onto, and it's pretty much toolless. It's also compatible with the 2.5-inch drives as well if you have SSDs. You just simply slide right in, and there's 2 tabs to log them in. I'm going to spread these out so that we can better dissipate the heat. And there we go. Finally, last but not least, we have the power supply, and we'll also hook up all the other cables. Now with this power supply, there is an eco mode feature that's indicated by the switch in the back. It's nice in theory, but I've heard of people having problems because of the temperature fluctuations within the power supply, so I'm going to keep it off. Alright, everything is now connected. Here is the moment of truth. Let's turn it on. Fingers crossed nothing blows up. I was researching all night, troubleshooting and trying to see what can cause the computer not to boot and not display anything on the screen, as well as having the I/O ports not working. I kind of had a hunch it might be the CPU, but I double checked the power connections. I make sure that the CPU is properly cooled and oriented. Nothing so far until I went to the MSI site. So going to the manufacturer of the motherboard, there's an update for the BIOS to support the 9th gen processor. How convenient. The only catch is that in order to update the BIOS, you need a working processor. So in order to use my processor on the motherboard that I have, I need to upgrade the BIOS. But in order to upgrade the BIOS, I need to have a working processor. So that's a bit of a catch-22. I have another machine that can possibly donate a processor temporarily for this to happen. So what's that machine? That's my home server right there. So this thing has a Core i3-6100U that uses the LGA 1151 socket. I just gotta be careful because this also does my backups and other things. And if you recall, this is actually the same server that I moved upstairs since I finished the basement. And if you haven't seen the Finishing the Basement series, I highly recommend it. I'll include links so that you can watch it later. But we have to move this downstairs anyway, so why not take advantage of the time to shut down the VMs, shut down the server, pull out the processor, clean things out in the case, and then put it in the proper permanent location. Okay, so this has become a multi-day operation. So I took out the old CPU, or the 9th gen CPU, the old CPU. The new one was a 6th gen processor, plugged it in there, fired it up, and 1 second later the PC turned off. So no luck there. And I thought, well, the motherboard was designed for the 8th gen processor, so maybe the 6th gen was a little bit too old even though it shared the same socket. So I managed to borrow an 8th gen processor. It's an i5 8600K. And after plugging it in, putting everything back together, it finally fired up. So I'm pretty excited, so let's continue. I was looking around and I did run across a disk that I'm not using, and as a matter of fact you can see the mount that's still attached from the laptop. So this could be a fun experiment to see how well it performs in this new PC.